thank you very much. First of all, I would like to welcome all of you. I hope you had a nice rest. You could sleep well after a very fruitful day yesterday, and I hope we can continue it. Before we will start with the content, I would like to say hello to Yehuda Bauer. I have spoken about you yesterday a little bit, but it's nice that now we can speak with you and we can listen to you tonight. And I've also explained a little bit so the special relation between this conference here and you, and that we have received the Yehuda Bauer Prize for this conference, and it's a very pleasure for us, all of us who we have organized this, have contributed to this. Thank you very much, and we are very happy that you have had a chance to come to us and be with us. Thank you very much. So now I would like to go directly into the content. I thought yesterday we had two sessions which from my point of view worked very well, and so hopefully if we use the same method today also it would work well. Today now the topic of the third panel is reaction in the German Ultimatum on the repatriation of Jews. And as we have organized and thought about this, we thought this is if you speak about repatriation of Jews, is a little bit euphemistic also, and that's the reason why we have asked Corey Gutstadt to give first a little historical introduction in what this means, what's the background of this, and then we will start to get three examples from what it meant to the behavior of three different states and the treatment of the humans in the states. So I skipped the introduction of you, Corey, because I think you are well known, at least because we have heard you yesterday also. And maybe, Corey, may I ask you to start?
Yeah, thank you, and hello to everybody. And it's just one small point. Actually, the anniversary of this ultimatum was the very first point for Bernd and me to start planning this conference. So, okay. Beginning in October 42, the German Foreign Ministry issued ultimatums to the governments of neutral countries and those allied with Germany to repatriate their Jewish citizens from countries and territories under German control. In the following, we will learn and discuss the different reactions by the governments of three of the concerned countries, Spain, Portugal, and Turkey, to this ultimatum. But before we go into this, I would like to outline the origins of this ultimatum, which is a product of the bureaucracy of genocide and the specific role of the German Foreign Office. In principle, the Nazi ideology did not differentiate between Jews of different countries. In practice, however, the Nazi regime was forced time and again to take foreign policy considerations into account. As early as between 1933 and 1939, prior to the war, the attacks against foreign Jews living in Germany triggered a number of interventions by the diplomatic representations of numerous countries. And the fear of repercussions for German foreign policy led repeatedly to discussions and finally to agreements between various ministries and party committees, and led to exceptions from some of the anti-Jewish measures for some Jews. Since these protest notes from diplomatic representations, as a matter of fact, were submitted to the Foreign Office, this ministry became directly involved in the issue and would eventually play a central role in shaping the policy of the Holocaust on foreign Jews. The occupation of Western European countries made this issue still much more important, since several 10,000s of foreign Jews were living in Western European countries. In France, for example, about half of the Jews were immigrants. And in Belgium, the proportion was even much higher, up to 90%. And their legal status as foreigners was complicated. International law guaranteed the life and property of citizens of neutral countries in military occupied territories. And Nazi Germany depended on keeping good relations with the neutral countries for the delivery of chrome or war reasons, and several reasons. So after the introduction of anti-Semitic measures in France, diplomats from several countries intervened and against these restrictions against their Jewish citizens. This again led to exemptions regarding first the confiscation of enterprises. So the first issue was the question of property. Even before the deportations began, the Foreign Office had made it clear that it reserved itself the right of consent to any measures affecting foreign Jews. This was a distribution of tasks between different Nazi agencies. It should certainly not be misunderstood in the way that the Foreign Office was less anti-Semitic than other German agencies, or that the Foreign Office tried to use its power to stop or to slow the persecution of the Jews. The Foreign Office only tried to conduct it more smoothly by taking foreign policy into consideration. When the German, in collaboration with the Vichy agency, started mass arrests of foreign Jews in France in the summer of '41, beside thousands of stateless Jews, or those considered as stateless by the Germans, as the Polish Jews or Czechoslovakian Jews, Jews of dozens of countries were arrested, which led again to protests by numerous diplomats in France. After long and controversial discussions in the Foreign Office, Jews with citizenship of neutral countries were eventually released from the camps of Drancy and Compiègne if the competent consulate confirmed their citizenships. And for this, in the spring of '42, the camp authorities or German offices sent name lists of Jewish detainees to the respective consulates, asking them to confirm the citizenship. So I have lists of Turkish Jews from Compiègne and Drancy, for example. The interventions of foreign diplomatic representations and fears of possible repercussions for German interests led the Germans to make exemptions for certain groups of Jews from various measures, including the requirement to wear the yellow badge. So they were in Nazi parlance called Nicht-Sternträger and considered not yet deportable. However, other measures were applied to them as well. Applications of the measures were completely inconsistent and contradictory because of the chaos of responsibility among German authorities. And also, we have to keep in mind that the Germans were very careful not to put these so-called exemptions in writing. These exemptions of certain groups of foreign Jews from deportation only constituted a temporary deferment, just as it did for certain other groups, for example, war veterans or Jews married to non-Jewish women. At the very least, foreign Jews were also to be driven permanently out of German-controlled territory. So, starting in the fall of '42, neutral countries, or Romania, Bulgaria, those allied to Germany, were given an ultimatum to repatriate their Jewish nationals from German-controlled areas, in Nazi parlance, to return them home, Heimschaffung. Otherwise, they would be, quote, included in the general measures regarding Jews, quote, end, which meant they would be deported and murdered, which of course was not told. The countries in questions were given the deadline first end of '42, and this was reported several times because most of the countries did not react for a long time. These ultimatums were first, to my knowledge, first set in France, then in other Western European countries, and then whenever the deportation began, for example, Salonika in May '43, in Greece, and the other part of Greece, and in Italy, when these parts were occupied by Germany. So in the following, we will learn about the reactions of Turkey, Spain, and Portugal. But before this, I would like to emphasize the perverse absurdity of these rules and regulations of genocide. I found, for example, thick files on single Turkish Jews documenting long correspondences between different German and Turkish agencies on how to treat one single Jewish person or his property, while in the same time period, every single day, the Jews were murdered by the thousands. Any description of this complex system of exemptions and deferments runs the risk of becoming entangled in its logic and trivializing the Nazis' bureaucrats' perfidiousness. The reason behind these exemptions was the goal of conducting the extermination of the Jews as smoothly as possible. To this end, the Foreign Office sought to conduct the persecution of the Jews with the consent of the respective governments, thus making them accomplices to the German crimes. For example, in the Turkish case, when Turkey only repatriated a very small number of its Jews, the Germans insisted on a written declaration that Turkey was not interested in the fate of the other some thousands. And the somewhat limited willingness of some of the countries who were approached was also used in Berlin for propaganda purposes. And finally, in retrospect, it is easy to misinterpret these governments' failure to react. With hindsight from now, we know that the offered return home would have saved the Jews of these countries from deportation. But in most cases, in the winter of 42-43, neither the governments nor the Jews themselves could have known this. Also, for the concerned Jews, a repatriation, which in retrospect was a possibility to save the lives, was an expulsion from the country they had built a new life. This is just to not misinterpret. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much, Corey, to give us this historical umbrella for what we would like to know with the example of 3 countries we would like to go deeper into. If there's not a strong protest, I would like to say if there are some questions, we can put it on a table all together after the 3 following lectures. And so we should continue. Or you will not stay here with us? Okay. So we will start with the country of Portugal. Right hand from my side, I'm quite happy to introduce Irene Pimentel. So from my professional background, I think it's very nice to read also that she works about the political investigation police, also during the dictatorship in Portugal. Of course, you know we work with the Gestapo and the SS, which is a real difference, but nevertheless, also we have many international institutions who are interested in having exchange how one can deal with the history of such criminal investigations police, especially in the process of establishing a democratic society afterwards. I think that's quite important. So we have also, if the history is different, so maybe in the construction of our work we have much things in common. But that's not the reason why we have invited you to this panel here. The reason is that you have worked also very intensively about Portugal during the Second World War, also about the question of women in this period, but, and now I come to the point, also about the Jews in Portugal during the Second World War. Your book is, which was published 2006, has a title, Escaping Hitler and the Holocaust. And so I would like to give you the floor to go deeper into what we have heard more general now in the case of Portugal, please.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much to Corey, to Jessica, to everyone who invited me. I'm very, very pleased to be here and to represent Portugal. Well, the geographic situation and circumstances provided by Portuguese neutrality the fact that the Portuguese dictatorship, despite similarities that it had with the German National Socialist regime, differentiated itself in significant ways, specifically by staying away from Nazi biological racism and anti-Semitism, eventually led to Portugal being a country that received some refugees. I quote, some refugees. It's very important, the number. But the regime merely tolerated their presence as long as the country was a transit shelter and closed its borders. I return a bit forward. After the Evian Conference, in which Portugal did not participate, from the 28th of October 38 onwards, the Jewish emigrants would need in Portugal 30 days tourism visas to be able to enter Portugal. That order covered for the first time a large specific group of candidates wanting to enter the country that had become identifiable from the moment Germany placed the letter J on Jewish passports. Precisely the Jews, those immigrants, it was treated as immigrants in Portugal, who were banned from returning to their country of origin. The main defender of those restrictive entry measures in Portugal was an inspector of the political police, at that time called PVDE, and international police, Paulo Cumano, a Germanophile anti-Semite. However, this idea was also shared by the director of this police. Also, the Portuguese Minister of Foreign Affairs, Salazar himself, assigned in November, Salazar was the dictator, everybody knows, assigned in November 39 only career diplomats with the exclusive rights to grant visas after consulting with the police and the Ministry of Foreign Affairs in passports of Jews expelled from their countries and refugees without exit visa for countries of destiny and without a guarantee of boarding in Lisbon. On 15 June 40, the day after the German occupation of Paris, diplomats received a new directive stating that 30-day transit visa could only be issued to refugees with tickets for travel and entry visa in destination countries. In ideology, in my perspective, was not crucial with regard to the opening or closing of its border, although the regime mistrusted, especially the political refugees, socialists or communists. I said yesterday, I think it was better to be a Jewish refugee in Portugal, to enter Portugal, not because of the laws, but in Portugal once entered, than a political refugee. What was central to Salazar's external policy was maintaining neutrality, made possible by the two camps. Portugal's collaboration, I don't have the time to enter, with Nazi Germany was extensive and in a big way at the economic, financial and commercial level, and the Portuguese help to the German war effort continued until 1944, especially exporting tungsten. It's very important that for the context, because in the repatriation moment, there were negotiations with the English to ban the exploitation of tungsten, and of course with the German. Although the Portuguese authorities were not aware of the exchange of correspondence, document from the Auswärtiges Amt, I'm not going to enter because it was already exposed by Claudia Ningusch, revealed that the German also included Portugal in their designs for the so-called final solution. I'm not going to enter that, but I think it's very, very important as a context too. Rother was the police attaché in the legation of Lisbon in German legation in Portugal, and discussed internally with Dietmar, a consultant of the German legation in Lisbon, whether to approach the Portuguese government in order to ask that they should prevent the immigration from Portugal overseas. What is very important, it was never approached, Portugal was never approached in that way because the German legation thought it was worthless, because Portugal would never do that. And why? Because it went contrary, absolutely contrary to the politics of Portugal, which was a transit land and wanted to expel, wanted the immigration overseas. So this politics in this moment was totally contradictory with the Portuguese policy. From 1943, things became easier for the very few refugees still in Portugal without a destination country visa, because they were in residencia fixa. I can then explain. Some had no documents and no destiny visa, and they stayed in Portugal, because aid organizations and allied governments started obtaining facilities for them. In that period, the allied and neutral countries, among which was included that of Portugal as a neutral, had already become aware, I know it's polemic, of what was happening in Poland and in the USSR, particularly after the issuing of December 1942 Allied Declaration. The Portuguese government found itself directly involved in the Holocaust when it was given the opportunity to decide over the fate of some Jews of Portuguese ascendancy or with Portuguese documents living in German occupied territories. On 4th of February 1943, the Nazi legation in Lisbon warned the Portuguese government that, and I quote, in the interest of German and military security, end of quote, from the 1st of April, all foreign Jews, including of Portuguese nationality, would be subject, and Corey has already told that, quote, to the provisions in force concerning Jews, including their identification, internment, and later expulsion, end of quote. Quote, as a courtesy, end of quote, Salazar's government was informed so that it could have the opportunity, quoting, to repatriate Jews of Portuguese nationalities from the territories under German rule. The Portuguese government systematically postponed taking a decision. I'm not going to enter, but who knows the policy of Salazar? It's a policy in itself to make it last and last and last, in order that things resolve themselves with the time. It's very typical of Salazar. On the 8th of March 1943, Salazar informed its diplomat in Berlin that the situation was being carefully studied because it involved delicate issues, end of quote, due to the corrupt or false origins of Portuguese nationality with which Jews say they have or think they have, end of quote. On 16th of March, a new telegram to the Portuguese legation in Berlin informed that a Portuguese Israeli of high standing had presented him, Salazar, requests from Dutch Jews of Portuguese descent so that it could intervene in allowing them to leave the Netherlands. Salazar added that this issue was different from the Jews of Portuguese nationality, quote from Salazar, of German Declaration of February, and that it was imperative to know if the German government would be willing to authorize the departure of Dutch Israeli families for whom Portugal could eventually recognize the ancestry of their claim. It's a complicated story from Holland. I can't then later explain a bit better. This Portuguese Israeli of high standing was the president of the Lisbon Israeli community, Moisés Amzalak, to whom the Portuguese leader told that the German minister in Lisbon, Einigen Hühne, had promised that the Jews in question, from Holland, had nothing to fear should they be Portuguese citizens. However, if they were considered Dutch Jews, they would be seen as enemies. Portugal, in this case of the Holland Jews, did nothing more, and in the post-war period, the then new head of the Portuguese legation in The Hague, António de Faria, calculated that of the 4,000 members of the Portuguese Israeli community in Holland, only 500 had been saved. On the 27th of March of 43, Salazar informed again his diplomat in Berlin that the legation in Portugal in Vichy requested for repatriation of 31 Portuguese Jews, 31. Due to that number being small, Salazar said that he had taken the political and humanitarian stance of granting them passports. The consul in occupied Paris, the Portuguese consul, stated that there were around 100 Portuguese Jews seeking repatriation, while the diplomat in Brussels communicated the names of 7. Salazar authorized their travel to Portugal, but warns that the, quote, high number of Jews indicated by the Paris consul, end of quote, required the examination of whether those Jewish families were of Portuguese ancestry or if they are registered at the consulate as nationals. Regarding the individuals who claimed having past Portuguese ancestry, as was the case of the Dutch Jews, Salazar clarified that the issue needed to be examined after an exchange of information in terms of numbers, standing, and situation. The same regarding Jews with nationality recognized in Portuguese documents. Should the number not be so inflated that it would lead one to believe it was abuse? I was quoting. The Portuguese government presented to the Germans on the 21st of April and 26th of May 2 lists with 109 Jews sent by the consuls in Brussels and Paris. Upon being transmitted to Eichmann, the list unleashed a controversy between the Auswärtiges Amt and Portuguese officials over the assets that those Jews were authorized to take. It is also documents and documents about that. Finally, they were able to transfer capital to provide for their upkeep. Even so, the director of the police commented that it was necessary to carry out a thorough verification of their identity and proposed only allowing to enter Portugal those who brought money and could prove to be in fact Portuguese. This time, however, the Portuguese Ministry of Foreign Affairs stated on March 44 that when it was possible to determine immediately who had Portuguese nationality, their entry in Portugal should be authorized on the condition to leave should it be proved that some were not in fact Portuguese. Well, it was at that time a big pressure from the Allied legations. Numbers. Around 137 Jews of Portuguese descent residing in France thus ended up arriving in Portugal in 3 groups from the 2nd of September until the November 43. On June 44, a last group of 47 left France, thus raising to 184 the number of Jews with Portuguese passports. In the telegram I already have quoted, message of 27 March from Salazar to the legation of Portugal in Berlin, Salazar said also to his diplomat that the German legation in Lisbon had told that the foreign Jews could leave Greece upon 15 of June. Informed by the Israeli community of Thessalonica, the Portuguese minister in Berlin answered that only 6 Portuguese Jews there sought repatriation. After prolonged and time-consuming negotiations, the Auswärtiges Amt sent to the Portuguese legation in Berlin on the 5th of May 44 a list with the names of 19, not 90, 19 Portuguese Jews. Incarcerated by the Germans in Athens, these had been transferred to the Bergen-Belsen, I think you are going to speak, with a Spanish train, to the Bergen-Belsen concentration camp, where they arrived on the 11th of August 43, and were placed in one of the neutralen lager before being or no repatriated to Portugal 10 months later. That was the time, 10 months later, that it took Salazar and his government to decide the fate of those Jews. And yet it was known at that time, precisely, not precisely, but it was known that the delay of refusal of repatriation would mean that their final destination was Auschwitz. And it was already known, not totally, but in part, what was Auschwitz. In the summer 44, only 19 Jews from Thessalonica arrived in Portugal. The Portuguese legation in Berlin sent Salazar another list of 13 Jews coming from Greece, whose repatriation had also been requested the previous months. I'm still studying this case because it's not the same group and I don't know what happened. I don't know if you have answer to that, Avram. So I'm going to conclude. To the question, was Portugal as neutral country a bystander, a rescuer, or a perpetrator? I would prefer to use the concept, like yesterday I said, of grey area from Primo Levi. As known, I don't need to explain the concept. Included for me, in my interpretation, this grey zone, for example, were the European neutral countries, including Portugal, where there were clearly various shades of behavior at the heart of the Salazar's regime itself. I'm not speaking about the public opinion because there was no public opinion in Portugal. It was censorship, it was a dictatorship, no democratic country. If we consider the Portuguese in general, there was clearly no anti-Semitic stance, with the exception of some far-right intellectuals, military, and police officials. That is, while most of them did not reveal a black complicity with the Third Reich, they also showed no attitude of white resistance to the Nazi regime. However, when we analyze spying, economic, finance, commercial, and police a relationship with Germany, we can say that Portugal was, in some times, a black zone. There were also few in the white zone, of course. One of these, I must not tell, was the Chancellor in Bordeaux, Aristide de Sousa Mendes. I just learned that another Portuguese was yesterday considered also as a savior by Yad Vashem. As everybody knows, Aristide de Sousa Mendes was punished for having disobeyed the Portuguese dictator, whose regime after the war could ironically state that Portugal had been a safe harbor for Jews fleeing the persecution of the National Socialism. Salazar and his government did very little to save the lives of those persecuted and did not offer direct assistance to the refugees, although he allowed aid organizations to set up in Portugal. He likewise played no part in denouncing the persecution and massacres carried out by the Nazis. The fact that most of those in power were located in the gray zone, made Portugal a transit country for some refugees, but where the number of those was much less than could have been expected, given the danger they had to face. In regard to the matter of the repatriation of Jews of Portuguese descent in 43 and 44, Portugal fell very short of what it could have done, only saving a tiny part of those who could prove their nationalities. Thank you very much.
Irene, thank you very much for this explanation of the development of this crucial years in Portugal, and also for the conclusion. It reminds me much of what we have heard yesterday, and I'm sure especially your conclusion gives us also the chance to to see how it is in other countries and to speak about it afterwards. If there are not specific questions for understanding what you have said, so my suggestion is that we would like to continue. And no one tries to raise a hand, so we will continue. So we come to Izzet Bahar. I welcome you here. So one could read if you look to the panel, that you are connected with the University of Pittsburgh. So sometimes you have to do a detour to write about your country of origin, but sometimes also maybe it's not so false to have a little bit of distance also to do this. But if you see the book, what was the reason that we have invited Izzet, is that he really went to many archives in Europe, not only in one country, in many countries. And the fundament for his dissertation, who deals with the Turkish policy vis-à-vis the Turkish Jews in German occupied country. And the title of this book is Turkey and the Rescue of the European Jews. In the paper with the CVs, you could read that it should be published at the end of this year. I went to the homepage of Rutledge and I've seen it's posted there at least. I don't know if it's really published, but at least I'm sure if you can ask to get it, and maybe if it will be published, it's here. But now we will hear what you would write there in a very short version. Thank you very much.
In the next 15 minutes, I would like to talk about the policies of the Turkish government with regard to Turkish Jews living in France during World War II and the fate of those Jews. Why France? Because France had by far the biggest number of Turkish Jews living in Europe in war years. And thanks to the documents that recently became available, we have a critical mass to clearly assess the relevant Turkish policies of the time. In fact, by analyzing France, we get an exact picture whether the Turkish government was then determined to protect her Jewish nationals trapped in German invaded territories, or would leave them to their own fate. When Germany entered Paris in June 1940, there were about 13,000 Turkish Jews living in France. These Jews were the Jews did not have French citizenship. A report written by the Turkish foreign minister gives us this figure. According to this document, there were 3,500 regular and 10,000 irregular Turkish Jewish citizens living in France. Now you can ask, what is this classification of regular citizenship versus irregular citizenship? Well, the answer is in the Turkish citizenship law of May 1928. Let's read the 10th article. The government may deprive of citizenship of those Turks residing abroad who fail to register with the Turkish consulates for a period exceeding 5 years. The Jewish nationals who fail to renew their registration were designated as irregular citizens. But I would like to emphasize the point that they were still Turkish citizens. And as you may notice, the law did not have a mandatory implication. It was up to the government. They might decide to deprive them from their citizenship or not, because the word in Turkish isterses means if she wants. What we see from a vast number of documents is the Turkish government chose to implement this law in its most negative way. They declined to take the Turkish Jews designated as irregular citizens under their protection starting from the first days of German occupation. A vast number of many documents attest to this implementation. Because of time limitation, I will present here just two. The first is a French document, which shows that the Turkish consulate in Paris declined to offer protection to 29 Turkish Jews detainees at the concentration camp Compiègne because they were irregulars. Please pay attention to the date. There were about 78, something like that, deportations from France to Auschwitz. The first one, it was 3 days after this date. We have the list of these 29 Turkish Jews. They were all deported with the first convoy. The first convoy was the only convoy departed from Compiègne. The others were from Drancy. And they perished a few months after their arrival to Auschwitz. The second example is about Bali brothers. In this document, the Turkish ambassador informs the mother of Alexander Bali, the one of the brothers, 22 years old, interned at Rancy, was not registered as a regular citizen, thus nothing could be done for him. Indeed, he was deported to Auschwitz, where he died. From a letter that was written and sent by his uncle to consulate, we also learned that Alexander Bali's father fought in First World War in Ottoman army, and also fought in Turkish army during Turkish Independence War with the rank Çavuş. In sum, the majority of Turkish Jews residing in France were designated as irregular citizens and were not given protection because of this 5-year rule, which was deliberately implemented in most negative way. And now, what about the regular citizens? Deportation started on a regular basis as of early June 1942. For Germans, the deportation of Jewish citizens of their allies and neutral countries is a kind of formal agreement with these countries. A memo of September 1942 shows how the German Foreign Office decided to handle this issue together with Turkey, Hungary, and Italy. Germany's intention was to notify Turkey to remove the Jews of Turkish nationality before January 1943, and those who would remain would face the same treatment as other Jews, that is deportation. In the second week of October, the German ambassador in Ankara, von Papen, gave this ultimatum to the Turkish government. On October 10, Italians explicitly rejected the proposal, and the deadline was postponed until to the end of March, which was the same deadline that was given to other neutral countries, Spain, Portugal, Sweden, and also Denmark and Finland. An event happened at the end of January 1943, provides us the hints to the intention of Turkey vis-à-vis this ultimatum. Let's read Ambassador Behic Erkin's memoir describing the response of Turkey to the forced evacuation of the Old Port region of Marseille by the Germans. I had informed Ankara about our subjects, the majority of whom were Jewish and had lost their homes during the evacuation of the old part of Marseille. As an answer, they told me not to send Jews by train convoys. I informed them that I interpreted this instruction not only as an answer to my cable, but as a definite order. This response of Ankara is quite interesting because based on a communication of Turkish Paris consulate, traveling in convoys was a German requirement for citizens to return to Turkey. Around March 1943, the Turkish government took a drastic decision which clearly shows their position in response to the ultimatum. Ankara ended the power of consulates to process visa applications by instructing them to dispatch every single visa or passport renewal application by Jews to Ankara for their investigation and approval. Here is a communication sent from the Paris consulate in January 1944, which shows how forwarding the applications to Ankara created a deadlock and particularly blocked the issues of visas and return of Turkish Jews to Turkey. For 1 year now, there have been continuous requests by the German authorities to neutral countries, including Turkey, to recall their Jews from occupied France. When we communicated this to our Ministry of Foreign Affairs, we were instructed that the influx of Jews as masses to the country was not desirable, and visas should not be issued before asking the approval of Ankara. Because of this instruction, while the Jews of all other neutral countries and Germany's allies have left France, our citizens could not send to Turkey. In fact, a letter sent by a Turkish consulate to Bahar as an example illustrates how the passport renewal applications of regular Turkish Jewish citizens were declined as a result of the instructions from Ankara. Since we have not received an order from the relevant authority for permission of your entrance to the country, there is no possibility for renewal of your passport. This is an example. This Turkish policy was in stark contrast to the German ultimatum. Throughout 1943, the deadline given to the Turkish government was postponed several times, each time with increased expression of annoyance. Indeed, a German report sent to the headquarters in Berlin contained complaints and accusations that the Turks were doing nothing but buying time. The German treatment of Turkish Jews became increasingly harsh, practically not different than their treatment of other Jews. A communication written by the Consulate of Paris in July 1943 reflects this change in German attitude. Starting from 1941, within the scope of operations to arrest and intern Jews, Turkish citizen Jews have been collectively arrested and sent to various camps. Those Turkish Jews, like the citizens of other neutral countries, were released from the camps in the spring of 1942. And the last sentence, however, in the last couple of months, the German authorities began to inform us that Turkish Jews could be released only with the condition of their return to Turkey. Of course, there is no need to say that, especially after July 1943, after Germany is taking direct control of the Rhine Sea, each day spent in the camp brought an extra risk of deportation. After several postponements, the deadline was negotiated once more in Berlin in November 1943. The Turkish diplomats finally agreed to deliver the list of Turkish Jewish citizens and withdraw them in convoys by January 31, 1944. On December 27, Ankara informed its diplomatic delegations in France that the restriction on the issuance of visa to regular Turkish Jewish citizens was finally lifted. And lastly, finally, after more than 1 year, the ultimatum, after the 414 Turkish Jews were sent to Turkey in 8 convoys. I would like to conclude with a chart that summarized my talk. 1942 is the year when the lowest percentage of Turkish Jews were deported to concentration camps because they were regarded by Germans as the citizens of neutral country. The German ultimatum was given at the end of 1942, and the deadlines were postponed several times during 1943. The special status of Turkish Jews got lost during this period, and Turkish Jews ended up being deported at about the same percentage as other nationality Jews. The year 1944 is when the deadline expired, and Germans had a free hand to dispose of Jews the way they liked. Sadly, the 7 months of 1944 marked the period where the highest percentage of Turkish Jews were deported to Auschwitz. Thank you for your kind interest.
Okay, so I think thanks to all the 4 lectures we could listen to a very fruitful session. They give some answers. We raised new questions, but before we try to answer the new questions, we should have a break. So please come back in around 12 o'clock that we can continue with the next section. Thank you very much.